Carmine the Snake Persico, from a teenager leading the toughest street gang in Brooklyn to notorious crime boss during the Colombo Wars. He never backed down from anyone or anything. The Snake played by his own rules to get what he wanted, in the streets, in court, and in prison.
Seth Ferranti here, your guide through the dark corners of the criminal underworld. As an outlaw filmmaker, author, and journalist, I've delved deep into the minds of gangsters, drug lords, and prison gangs. But my journey doesn't stop there. Let me take you on a thrilling ride as we explore the hidden stories and untold truths that lurk behind the prison walls.
Carmine the Snake Persico's status in the American Mafia was something of an anomaly. He wasn't a rat and was even powerful enough during his multiple-decade reign to call shots from prison after being convicted in the infamous Commission Trial. The Brooklyn Don has become possibly one of the most polarizing mob figures of the last 50 years, both in the underworld and in mainstream pop culture. He was the last real mob boss of our time.
Carmine the Snake Persico. He was the last real mob boss of our time, a certified old school OG, who some have labeled the immortal. But others argue with equal passion that Persico was only ever out for one person, himself, and that persona led to him being called the Snake. Persico was a vicious and cunning mobster that betrayed his comrades to get ahead. To be able to keep power that long from inside prison speaks to the respect he and his family commanded on the street. When Persico died, so did the real American Mafia. His rise in the criminal underworld had a very atypical origin, said Christian Cipollini, the author of Murder, Inc., Mysteries of the Mob's Most Deadly Hit Squad. Persico's family had it pretty good. His youth didn't bear the earmarks of poverty. That said, Persico grew up in an era when legit business folks had nothing on their spec that a lot of Brooklyn kids may have sought and found in the wise guys who basically ran the show, so to speak. Persico, like many other kids from New York in the mid-20th century, looked at the mob guys with a gleam in their eyes. To the Brooklyn kids, the mobsters were the rock stars of their neighborhood. They represented a way of life that defied the law and did things their own way. Persico came up through the streets at a young age. He was a hot-headed, tough little guy who dropped out of school and joined a local gang, the Garfield Boys, where he made his mark while still just a teenager. The youngster upped the ante when he allegedly killed a rival during a brawl. In 1950, Carmine's Garfield Boys had a rumble with the Tigers in front of the boathouse in Prospect Park. A fight over a girl just like in West Side Story, said Michael Benson, the co-author of Carmine the Snake, Carmine Persico, and his murderous mafia family. When it was over, one tiger was dead with bullets in his guts, and another writhed on the ground clutching stab wounds.
You know, the Profaci family, one of the 5 families in New York, they were interested in Persico at a real young age. This dude from a teenager, man, you know, he would fight dudes, he would do whatever. He was a badass, man. This dude was getting down. And, you know, when he was real young, he caught a murder charge. You know, so that was like crazy. It was like this big battle at the park or something, and he came out with a murder charge. He was getting arrested and he was getting away with stuff. So, you know, to the mob, he was an up-and-comer, definitely.
No one remembers a time when Carmine wasn't a gangster. In grade school, he shook down students for their lunch money. The street brawl incident earned Persico major street credibility, particularly piquing the interest of a Profaci family capo. From there on, he moved up the ranks as a good earner and, when needed, a guy who could bring the muscle.
This is what a gang fight looks like. Different towns call them by different names. In New York, it's a rumble. And in case you think this might be just a letting off of boyish steam, look here. These are weapons New York police have actually seized in such fights. They were made for killing, and frequently, that's what street gangs have done with them.
By the time he turned 20, he'd already been arrested for murder twice. When he got old enough, he started working his way into the Profaci family, who were already controlling the Red Hook area of Brooklyn. With a reputation as a tough guy, Persico found that his talents were in high demand. Him and his brother, Alley Boy, started moving up the ladder, explains Frank DiMatteo, who co-wrote Carmine the Snake and was a mafia associate himself during the era. Persico was a gangster's gangster, a man whose life served as the inspiration for not only West Side Story, but The Godfather too. A gangster on the rise, Carmine the Snake, Persico elevated his reputation in a stunning manner. In 1957, he participated in one of the most infamous hits ever with the brazen assassination of Murder Inc.'s head honcho, Albert Anastasia. It was his most defining mob moment. Bumping off Albert Anastasia as he was being shaved on Park Avenue changed the course of mob history. Persico became a made man at 24, the youngest in family history. Him, Joey Gallo, Larry Gallo, and Joe Jelly allegedly got the orders to go kill Albert. Jelly, the Gallo brothers, and Persico went and killed him.
Forget everything you know about America's war on drugs. Where it started, when it started, and most importantly, who was involved. This is the untold history of America's original drug lords.
Colombo Wars set the stage for uncertainty, something the families had never seen. Even after the war, the crews weren't separated. They were shylocking in the same neighborhoods. These guys had clubs together. Then in between the war, they had to hide because they were shooting at each other because of the beef. You know, they were hitting the mattresses. They knew how to run the streets in their favor, but they weren't prepared for this type of unrest. You know, war, internal war causes all types of crazy stuff and makes it so, you know, stuff just can't run. You can't get money.
Persico's rep for being merciless in his mob affairs goes all the way back to the first Colombo family war of the 1960s, where he earned his alternate nickname, the Snake, for his treachery, relates Scott Bernstein, the author of Mafia Prince, Inside America's Most Violent Crime Family and the Bloody Fall of La Cosa Nostra. Historically, Carmine and Crazy Joe Gallo came up in the streets together. They were very close and in the same crew at one time. What happened was that Gallo and his brothers wanted to pull away from the Profazzis because they didn't like the leadership. They didn't think Joe Profacci was a good boss. They accused Profacci of stiffing the rank and file from a fair share of the family profits. The Gallo brothers were renegades, and when they were plotting and trying to get the other captains to go on their side to make this move to break away, Persico was with them. At one point, Profacci got to Carmine and offered him something lucrative. Persico invited Larry Gallo to a meeting, and Larry, not knowing that Carmine already went back with Joe Profacci, went to see him. When he arrived, Persico tried to kill Larry. Carmine's old running partner, Larry, would have been dead that day in 1961 at the Sahara Lounge in Brooklyn if a beat cop hadn't wandered in, wondering why the door was open on a Sunday morning. After the attempted hit, Persico was dubbed the Snake for switching sides during the internal mob war, which came to be known as the First Colombo War. In the Mafia, treachery is rewarded. Friends kill friends to become the top dog. Frank Punchy Iliano, a Genovese capo, was the one who gave Persico his infamous moniker. Carmine was going to court with his guys as Punchy was coming out. They had a confrontation and Punchy told Persico, "You're a fucking snake."
They had to figure out what to do. Who's taking the club? Who's not taking the club? Who's taking the numbers? That's why it was such a big headache. It wasn't just one gang fighting another gang. It was an internal battle. After the shooting stopped, everybody had to go back together again. That was the way it worked in the Mafia.
After Profacci, Joe Colombo took over. He made peace in 1964 with the Gallo brothers. At the time, Persico was in jail for another short bid. Joe Colombo was the boss between 1964 and 1972, and Carmine Persico was a skipper. His crew was very strong. They ran all of one side of South Brooklyn, and even intermingled with the Gallos at the time. The Gallos were part of the Profaci family, which then turned into Colombos. Even after the war, the crews weren't separated. They were shylocking in the same neighborhood. These guys, before the shooting started, had clubs together. Then in between the war, they had to hide because they were shooting at each other because of the beef. After the shooting stopped, everybody had to go back together again. When Joe Colombo got shot, Carmine was the front runner. He was in line to take over. That's why he became acting boss at the time until the commission okayed it. That's how Carmine got that position. He was in jail and had to leave Joseph Joe Iacovelli, who was under him in charge. Crazy Joe Gallo was doing his own bid, and when he got out in 1971, Persico put an open hit order on him, igniting the Second Colombo War. A Gallo member was ultimately blamed for the Joe Colombo shooting, but an open hit is an open hit. It means anybody can take the shot. There was no love loss. When Joey was executed, the Persicos became kings of the Colombo Hill.
Yeah, well, this was a place where Crazy Joe Gallo, this is where he was killed. Yeah, I guess he was sitting down, I think he was sitting down with a few people. They came in, they shot him and left.
Carmine loved wartime. He was always on the winning side, even when the snake had to stab his so-called friends in the back to do it.
Forget everything you know about America's war on drugs. Where it started, when it started, and most importantly, who was involved. This is the untold history of America's original drug lords.
In 1986, a Mafia Commission trial began. 5 mob chieftains were indicted as the federal government, with lead prosecutor Rudy Giuliani tried to take down the mob's hierarchy by convicting the bosses who resided on the commission. Big Paul Castellano, Fat Tony Salerno, Tony Dux Corralo, Rusty Rastelli, and Persico were all facing time for being the heads of New York's 5 families.
The Persicos were a large family with an ominous presence within the Colombos, says Larry McShane, author of Chin, The Life and Crimes of Mafia Boss Vincent Gigante. Carmine's brothers Alphonse and Theodore joined the Profaci-led family while young, and a second generation followed. The Persicos took over following Joe Colombo's shooting, and another son, Michael, became a powerful figure. But that power didn't stop the law from continuing to convict Persico of crimes relating to his mafia leadership.
Well, here in New York today, after 5 days of deliberation, an anonymous federal court jury convicted 3 crime bosses of serving on the so-called Mafia Commission. 5 lower-ranking mob figures were also convicted on all counts for carrying out the commission's orders. Authorities had contended that since 1930s, that organized crime had a national board of directors carving out territory and settling disputes. Now an FBI man says that all the members are either in the grave or headed to prison.
In 1986, the Mafia Commission trial began. 5 mob chieftains were indicted as the federal government, with lead prosecutor Rudy Giuliani tried to take down the mob's hierarchy by convicting the bosses who resided on the commission. Big Paul Castellano, Fat Tony Salerno, Tony Dux Corralo, Rusty Rastelli, and Persico were all facing time for being the heads of New York's 5 families. At the trial, Persico decided to represent himself. He had been through so many cases that he thought he was the best person to defend himself against the charges. It would prove to be a big mistake.
Colombo family boss Carmine Persico Jr. may have been the one to suffer most today. Earlier this week, he was sentenced to 39 years in prison on a previous rackets conviction. Persico couldn't even blame today's conviction on his lawyer, since the mobster chose to act as his own attorney throughout the trial. Stanley Meyer was Persico's legal advisor.
I think he did a great job.
And
but the way it turns out, it doesn't matter. In other words, it's impossible. I think the whole system is geared against any of these defendants.
He thought he was smart enough to do it himself. A lot of guys wouldn't do that. Carmine just had the balls to do it. He really thought they had nothing on him. He really felt that it was all hearsay and bullshit. He thought he was going to win that. He put a good argument up, which even the judge complimented him on. But you ain't going to win against the feds. Rudy Giuliani's war on the mob stirred such a panic across New York's 5 families that a meeting of the bosses was called, wherein the suggestion of having the zealot prosecutor whacked came up.
John Gotti, who came into power after taking out Castellano, and Carmine Persico both voted to retaliate. The two didn't get their way after the other 3 bosses in the meeting gave the idea a thumbs down. Giuliani hated the mafia, and Persico in particular, with a passion. He wasn't pulling any punches and was on a mission to throw the book at Persico and the other mafia leaders. Persico knew it was part of the game, but has often reflected on Giuliani.
In prison, he told Robert Rosso, "I've been in prison almost 30 years and I'm still married. I talk to my wife every night. She comes and sees me, and I have kids that I love and adore, whom I'm close to." Giuliani's been married 3 times, and his kids hate him so much they won't even talk to him. Who's the dog?
Which one was, other than the one you mentioned, was the most interesting to you as you were researching it?
Yeah, I like the snake article too. I mean, you know, that dude, I mean, he had a really long career. You know, I mean, they said like he was controlling, you know, that stuff from the penitentiary for like ever. You know, like that dude, even like his history, like you go all the way back to like the 60s and 70s, you know, and he was with like one faction, and then he switched up. So there's all these different dynamics, because it depends on who you talk to.
What story you get.
Yeah, and what story you get. You know, to some, you know, he was a betrayer. You know, to others, he was like, you know, a really cunning, smart dude. So I think he kind of epitomizes, you know, like the Mafia Don. I mean, you know, everybody talks about Gotti, or everybody talks about Luciano, but you look at some of these other dudes, man. I mean, these dudes were in the trenches, man. And I mean, anybody that knows that life, I mean, that's a violent, cutthroat life, and you got to be a super cunning dude. And I respect kind of like, maybe not necessarily the most violent guys in that life, but I respect, like, you know, the manipulators, the ones that kind of move around. And I think the Snake was like one of those dudes.
Persico wanted to do just one thing with his life, be the leader of a gang. His dream came true as a teenager, as boss of the Garfield Boys, the toughest and deadliest gang out there. And his dream came true again years later when he became the boss of the Colombo crime family.
After serving 33 years of a 139-year prison sentence, Carmine Persico died of complications arising from diabetes, according to his lawyer. The 85-year-old crime boss was known as the Snake, a nickname he reportedly hated.
The Snake was a true mafioso, an OG of epic proportions. You know, this dude has gone down in the annals of gangster lore as a bad motherfucker. Not only a gangster legend, but a devoted family man. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Seth Ferranti's True Crime. Watch, hit the like button, make a comment, tell me who you want me to cover, and definitely subscribe.